thank you very much, Robin. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here. My first visit to Manchester. I've driven by it many times, but I've been to Concord, I've been to other parts of New Hampshire, but it's my first visit. I'm delighted to be here. I want to talk about the origins of constitutionalism in America. And it's appropriate because this is close to Constitution Day. That was last week. And as you know, the Senate or the Congress of the United States has compelled all schools that receive federal aid, and maybe you don't, to honor Constitution Day by having some event that honors the Constitution. So maybe this will fulfill that obligation. Now, the first thing we have to do in understanding the origins of constitutionalism, American constitutionalism, is emphasize the fact that the founders who created our constitutional structure were Englishmen. Or even when they were not Englishmen, they thought like Englishmen. That Englishness was important, and we tend to forget it. Our founders had a long history, sometimes over a century, of experience with self-government, with common law, with rights. And so we ought to be more patient when we see other peoples in the world struggling to put together their constitutions. We had tremendous advantages because of that English experience. And they knew how important it was. John Jay, who was one of the important founders, was 3/8 French, 5/8 Dutch. That is, no English ancestry whatsoever. Nevertheless, Jay could write with a straight face in Federalist No. 2 that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint councils, arms, and efforts have nobly established general liberty and independence. So that sense of being Englishmen was very important to the founding. Now, unlike many of the European countries, which existed as nations before they were states, America was a state before it was a nation. And today it may not even be a nation in any traditional meaning of the term nation. If nations are imagined communities, then the new United States in the late 18th century was imagined as something resembling England, even by those like Jay who were not English. 18th century Americans thought that England had become corrupted, but they believed that at one time England had been the dominant source of liberty and popular government in the world, its constitution celebrated by liberal intellectuals everywhere. Thus it was fitting that the Anglo-Americans, which is the title most Europeans gave to Americans in the early 19th century, it was appropriate that these Americans, Anglo-Americans, should become the heirs of this popular tradition of English rights, English liberty. We forget that from Elizabeth I's time on, England saw itself as the carrier of liberty, of carrying the torch of liberty, and we had inherited that. Americans thought that the torch of English freedom had been passed to them, that they had a responsibility to make it shine brighter and more enduringly than the English had been able to do. The Americans were intent on avoiding the corruption that they thought plagued the English Constitution. And that meant that they had to deviate from the English constitutional tradition in a number of ways. And in fact, comparing the Americans' constitutional developments at the end of the 18th century with the English constitutional system, which they broke away from, can, I think, help illuminate just what is distinctive about American constitutionalism. And that's going to be the focus of this talk. I want to emphasize 3 points: the nature of the Constitution, the separation of powers, and the issue of representation and sovereignty. Those are the 3 basic distinctions I think that Americans made. Now, the most obvious difference between 18th century English and American constitutionalism was the revolutionaries, our revolutionaries' conception of a constitution as a written document, as a fundamental law circumscribing the government. Before something we just take for granted today, when we talk about the Iraqis making a constitution, the Afghans making a constitution, we actually assume it's going to be a written constitution. But that wasn't true prior to our experience in the 18th century. Before the Revolution, a constitution was rarely ever distinguished from the government and the government's operations. Traditionally, in English culture, the Constitution referred both to the way the government was put together or constituted and to the fundamental rights that the government was supposed to protect. The 18th century English Constitution was an unwritten mixture of laws, customs, principles, and institutions, and still is. By the end of the Revolutionary era, however, the Americans' idea of a constitution had become something very different. The Constitution was now seen to be no part of the government at all. It was a written document, distinct and superior to all the operations of government. A constitution was, as Thomas Paine said in 1791, a thing antecedent to a government. And a government is only the creature of a constitution. And, said Paine, it was not a thing in name only, but a fact. In fact, it was something you could pick up. It could be possessed by every family and carried about like the Bible, to be quoted and cited article by article. Such a constitution could never be an act of the legislature. It had to be the act of the people themselves, declared James Wilson in 1790, who was one of the principal framers of our Constitution. And in their hands, said Wilson, it is clay in the hands of a potter. They have the right to mold, to preserve, to improve, to refine, and furnish it as they please. And this has been the way, I think, most people today think of constitutions. In fact, over the last 25, 30 years, 69 constitutions have been created throughout the world, all written documents. It's just the assumption now that they're going to follow the American pattern. Now, the 18th century Englishman thought that this American idea of a constitution was, as the British writer Arthur Young caustically suggested in 1792, a pudding made from a recipe. The Americans had become convinced that the English had no constitution at all. Now, as much as Americans now take for granted that a constitution is a written fundamental law, the idea was not easily arrived at, and we should not assume that they quickly grasped this and understood all of its implications immediately. They fumbled and stumbled to make sense of this thing that we now take for granted. They began the debate, the colonists began the debate with Great Britain in the 60s, thinking about constitutional issues in much the same way as their fellow Englishmen. Like the English at home, they believed that the principal threat to the people's ancient rights and liberties had been the prerogative powers of the king, those vague and discretionary but equally ancient rights of authority that the king possessed in order to carry out his responsibility for governing the realm. That is, the power to declare war, for example, or wage war. Those are prerogative powers that the king and the crown today in England still has. Gordon Brown can go to war by a ministerial decision. He doesn't have to get Parliament, in fact, constitutionally, because it's a prerogative power. So those prerogative powers were set in opposition to the rights, the ancient rights of the people. So there was a conflict through history, going back to Magna Carta or before, between power and liberty, between an encroaching monarchy on one hand and freedom-loving people on the other. Time and again in the colonial period, Americans, like their fellow Englishmen at home, have been forced to defend themselves against the intrusions of royal prerogative power. And they relied for their defense on their colonial assemblies, their rights as Englishmen, and what they called their ancient charters. Now, in appealing to written documents as confirmations of their liberties, the colonists acted no differently from other Englishmen. From almost the beginning of their history, Englishmen had appealed to written documents. Even though they had no written constitution, they had written documents, Magna Carta, for example, in defense of their rights against the crown's power. All of these documents, from Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights of the Glorious Revolution of 1689, were merely written evidence of those fixed principles of reason from which Englishmen believed their Constitution was derived. Although 18th century Englishmen talked about the fixed principles and the fundamental law of their Constitution, few of them ever doubted that Parliament, as the representative of the nobles and people in the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and as the sovereign lawmaking body of the nation, they never doubted that Parliament was the supreme guarantor and interpreter of those fixed principles and that fundamental law. Parliament was in fact the bulwark of their liberties against the Crown's encroachment. It alone defended and confirmed the people's rights. The Petition of Right, the Act of Habeas Corpus, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of 1689 is simply an act of Parliament. Statutes not different in form from other laws passed by Parliament. That's what's meant by parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament enacted the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protects the people from the Crown, not from the Parliament, which is the creator of the Bill of Rights. Very different from our own Bill of Rights. For Englishmen, therefore, as William Blackstone, the great 18th century jurist, pointed out, there could be no distinction between the Constitution, or frame of government, and the system of laws. All were of a piece. Every act of Parliament was part of the Constitution, and all law, both customary and statute law, was thus constitutional. Therefore, concluded the 18th century English theorist William Paley, the terms constitutional and unconstitutional mean legal and illegal. Now, nothing could be more strikingly different from what Americans came to believe. Indeed, it was precisely on this distinction between legal and constitutional that the American and English constitutional traditions diverged at the time of the Revolution. During the 1760s and 70s, the colonists came to realize that although acts of Parliament, like the Stamp Act of 1765, might be legal, that is, made in accord with the acceptable way of making law, such acts could not thereby be automatically constitutional. That is, in accord with the basic principles of rights and justice that made the English Constitution what it was. It was true that the English Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement of 1701 were only statutes of Parliament, but surely, and I'm quoting here from a colonial newspaper, the colonists insisted they were of a nature more sacred than those which established a turnpike road. Is the statute establishing the Bill of Rights to be considered an ordinary statute? That's what the colonists kept saying. Under this kind of pressure, the Americans came to believe that the fundamental principles of the English Constitution had to be lifted out of the lawmaking and other institutions of government and set above them. Thus, in 1776, when Americans came to make their own constitutions for their newly independent states, they inevitably sought to make them fundamental and to write them out in documents. These state constitutions of 1776, 1777, which were immediately translated into European languages, captured the imagination of the enlightened people everywhere. And they really are, in some respects, more important than the federal constitution, which was derivative of the state constitutions. That was the major innovation the Americans made in 1776, 77. And it was the innovation that fascinated Europeans. But it was one thing to define the Constitution as fundamental, different from ordinary legislation, and something circumscribing the institutions of government. It was quite another to make this distinction between constitution and law effective. How do you do that? Since the constitutions were created by the legislatures, they presumably could also be changed by the legislatures. Now, some of the constitution makers in 1776 grasped the problem, and they tried to deal with it. Delaware, for example, provided for a supermajority. 5/7 of the legislature was needed to change the Constitution. Maryland said that its Constitution could only be amended by a 2/3 vote of 2 successive legislatures. You see the problem. They say, well, we can't just have it just be a statute. But how do you make it? Well, we'll make it a little more difficult. A supermajority, or 2 legislatures in a row have to pass it. They recognize the problem, but they're not quite sure how to do it. That's what I mean by stumbling and fumbling towards a solution. Most states, however, simply enacted their constitutions as if they were regular statutes. Everyone believed they were a special kind of law, but they didn't know how to make it a special kind of law, at least at the outset. Now, in the years following, Americans struggled with this problem of distinguishing fundamental from statutory law. And no one struggled more persistently than Thomas Jefferson. In 1779, Jefferson knew from experience, as he put it, I'm quoting here, that no legislature elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only could restrain the acts of succeeding legislatures. Thus he realized that to declare his great act for establishing religious freedom in Virginia to be irrevocable would be of no effect in law. Yet we are free. He wrote into his bill, his 1779 bill, in a kind of frustration. Yet we are free, he said, to declare, and do declare, that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present act, or to narrow its operation, such an act will be an infringement of natural right. That kind of throwing out a curse on anybody who tampers with this important piece of legislation. That, I think, expresses the frustration he felt. How can I make this so fundamental that nobody can overturn it easily? And he couldn't, because it was just a statute. But he realized that this paper declaration was not enough, and something more was needed. And in the 1780s, both he and his friend Madison, James Madison, were eager, as he said, to form a real constitution for Virginia, since the existing constitution, as he said, was merely an ordinance with no higher authority than any other ordinance of the same session. He wanted a constitution that would be perpetual and unalterable by other legislatures. And the only way that could be done, he said, was have the Constitution created by a power superior to that of the legislature. By the time he came to write his notes on the state of Virginia in the early 1780s, 1785, the first publication of that book, the answer had become clear. To render a form of government unalterable by ordinary acts of assembly, wrote Jefferson, the people must delegate persons with special powers. They have accordingly chosen special conventions to form and fix their governments. It all seems so simple to us today. We have constitutional conventions, and states have used them over and over again. But that was difficult to arrive at. And I think that Jefferson's stumbling is part of that problem of working that out. Massachusetts had actually led the way in 1780. It elected a convention specially designed to form a constitution, and it then placed that constitution before the people for ratification. And as a consequence, Massachusetts has the oldest constitution in the world, the oldest written constitution in the world. The oldest national constitution, written national constitution in the world is our national constitution. But Massachusetts actually goes back to 1780. When the Philadelphia Convention drew up a new constitution for the nation in 1787, it knew what to do. It had this previous experience of Massachusetts. It declared that the new constitution had to be ratified by the people, meeting in state conventions called for that purpose only. Constitutional conventions and the process of ratification made the people themselves the actual constituent power. As enlightened Europeans realized, these devices were some of the most distinctive contributions that we Americans would make to world politics. But these weren't the only contributions. With the conception of a constitution as fundamental law, immune from legislative encroachment, more firmly in hand, some state judges during the 1780s began cautiously moving in isolated cases to impose restraints on what the assemblies were enacting as law. In effect, they said to the legislatures, as George Wythe, who was a judge of the Virginia Supreme Court, said in 1782, "Here is the limit of your authority, and hither shall you go, but no further." These were the hesitant beginnings of what we come to call judicial review, the remarkable practice by which judges in the ordinary courts of law have the authority to determine the constitutionality of acts of the state and federal legislatures, popular legislatures. Now, this development of judicial review came very slowly and was contested in every step of the way. It was not easy for people in the 18th century, any more than today. Even those who were convinced that many of the acts of the state legislatures in the 80s were unjust and unconstitutional, to believe that unelected judges could could set aside acts of the popularly elected legislatures. This seemed to be an undemocratic usurpation of power. But as early as 1787, James Iredell of North Carolina, soon to be appointed Associate Justice of the newly created Supreme Court of the United States, saw that the new meaning Americans had given to a constitution had clarified the responsibility of judges to determine the law. The Constitution in America, said Iredell, was not only a fundamental law, but also a specially popularly created law in writing, limiting the powers of the legislature, and with which every exercise of those powers must necessarily be compared. Judges, he said, were not arbiters of the Constitution or usurpers of legislative power. They were, he said, merely judicial officials fulfilling their duty of applying the proper law. When faced with a decision between the fundamental unrepealable law made especially by the people and an ordinary statute enacted by a legislature, contrary to the Constitution, they must simply determine which law was superior. Judges could not avoid exercising this authority, concluded Iredell, for in America a constitution was not a mere imaginary thing about which 10,000 different opinions may be formed, but a written document to which all may have recourse and to which, therefore, the judges cannot willfully blind themselves. Though Iredell may have been wrong about the number of different opinions that could arise over a written constitution, we know there could be probably 10,000 different interpretations. But he was certainly right about the direction judicial authority in America would take. So the way is prepared for Supreme Court Justice John Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison in 1803 and the subsequent bitterly contested development of the practice of judicial review, a practice that many Europeans soon became aware of and were surprised by it. Unlike the European and the Israeli constitutional courts, the American courts are not special courts with special constitutional responsibilities separate from ordinary law adjudication. This is very different from, our court system is very different from the ones that now exist in Europe or in Israel. It's an important point of distinction, and the implications of this are not easily spelled out because the European and Israeli constitutional courts are so special, especially designed just to handle constitutional issues, not ordinary issues, but constitutional issues. They are usually protected from partisanship by elaborate mechanisms of appointment. The Israeli system of appointment, for example, is indirect and largely removed from the politics of the Knesset. And as we know only too well from our own experience, we Americans have no such indirect method of appointing judges. Thus, Senate filibustering of appointments has become a crude means of requiring a supermajority for many federal court appointments. Of course, this is simply a measure of how significant judges have become in our constitutional system. Now, as important as the idea of a written constitution, distinguishable from ordinary statute law, was in the 18th century, it was not, I think, the most significant constitutional deviation that the Americans made from their inherited English tradition. More important, I think, was what we call the idea of separation of powers. Now, Montesquieu, the famous French theorist in the 18th century, had praised the English Constitution for separating the executive, legislative, and judicial powers of government. But Montesquieu did not understand precisely what was happening to the English Constitution in the 18th century. The legislature, that is Parliament, and the executive, that is the King's ministry, were in fact becoming blurred as England stumbled into what eventually became its modern parliamentary system of responsible cabinet government. Now, the key to the British system, and it's still the key, is the fact that the ministers of the Crown are simultaneously members of Parliament. They have to be. If one of Gordon Brown's ministers loses his seat in either the House of Lords or the House of Commons, he immediately they have to find another seat for him, or else he cannot be a minister. He has to be a member of the Parliament, either one of the two houses, in order to hold executive authority. This linkage, the Americans did not like. They labeled it corruption. And they were determined to destroy this kind of corruption in 1776. Thus, in their state constitutions that they drew up, they excluded from the assemblies all members of the executive branch, so that, as the New Jersey Constitution declared, the legislative department of this government may, as much as possible, be preserved from all suspicion of corruption. You see, the English system started by the Crown was a way of buying off some support. The Crown controlled about a third of the seats of the House of Commons. And they would appoint members to Crown offices. And that way, they got their support in the House of Commons. This seemed to be corruption to the Americans. But it was, of course, in the long run, the source of parliamentary government, which is the practice that is followed by most democratic states in the world today. Our separation of powers was repeated in the federal government, of course, in Article 1, Section 6, and prevents the development, unless we change the Constitution, of any kind of parliamentary responsible government in the United States. Now, so that's a major difference, and we're off in a different direction, and direction that is not generally followed by most democratic states. Most have gone down the English path. They have parliamentary systems of government where the cabinet or the ministry is made up of members of the legislature, and that connection is crucial. For us, we separated simply because we thought it was corruption. Those are important, those two distinctions that I made, or two differences. Written Constitution, separation of powers, but more fundamental, I think, a more fundamental deviation has to do with, between us and the British, has to do with the concept of representation, or it starts with the concept of representation. Now, during the debates over the nature of the empire in the 1760s and 70s, the English tried to vainly to justify Parliament's taxation of the colonies. They were passing the stamp act, the Townsend duties, and so on. They argued that the American colonists, like Englishmen everywhere, were subject to acts of Parliament through a system of what they called virtual representation. They actually used that term, virtual representation, well before the internet was invented. Even though the colonists, and I'm quoting here one of the defenses, even though the colonists, like 9/10 of the people of Britain, did not in fact choose any representative to the House of Commons, they were undoubtedly a part, and an important part, of the Commons of Great Britain. They are represented in Parliament in the same manner as those inhabitants of Britain who have no voices in elections. And there were large numbers of people who had no voices in elections. In fact, only about 1 out of 6 adult males in England could vote by the middle of the 18th century. Now, to most Englishmen at home, this argument, mainstream Englishmen, this argument made a great deal of sense. Centuries of history had left Britain with a confusing mixture of sizes and shapes of its various electoral districts. Some of the constituencies were large, with thousands of voters, but others were small, and more or less in the pocket of a single great landowner, like Old Sarum, had no voters whatsoever, but continued to send 2 members to the House of Commons, and they were in the hands of a local landowner who just simply appointed them. Many of the electoral districts were rotten boroughs. And then there were some, like Dunwich, the town Dunwich, continued to send representatives to Parliament, even though it had long since slipped into the North Sea. At the same time, as you have these places that have no people sending representatives, you have some of England's largest cities, such as Manchester and Birmingham, which had grown suddenly up in the 18th century, 50,000 people in these manufacturing towns. They sent no representatives to Parliament. Now, the British justified this hodgepodge of representation. It's so contrary to our own experience, it's hard to even appreciate the English argument, but it should be appreciated. The English justified this hodgepodge by claiming that each member of Parliament represented the whole British nation, and not just the particular locality that representative supposedly came from. Requirements that the MPs being members of Parliament, that they reside in the constituencies they represented, had long since, they had been medieval requirements, but they had long since been ignored, and of course are still not necessary for MPs today. Gordon Brown has a minister that's in a unsafe district, he can go and find another district for him. He doesn't have to reside in it. We do that. I mean, we have some efforts of this, but it's always controversial. Like when Hillary Clinton moved to New York to be the senator from New York, or Bobby Kennedy did the same thing. It raised a lot of eyebrows. But they had to be representatives. They had to live in that state or that district. And that's still true in America. But it was not true, and it's still not true in Britain today. So according to this idea of virtual representation, people were represented in England not by the process of election. That's the crucial issue, which was considered incidental to representation, but rather by the mutual interest that members of Parliament were presumed to share with all Englishmen for whom they spoke, including those like the colonists who did not actually vote for these representatives. So you're representing the whole nation, and how you got to office is irrelevant. That election is not the criterion of representation. Now the Americans, of course, strongly rejected these British claims that they were virtually represented in the same way that the non-voters of cities like Manchester and Birmingham were. They challenged the idea of virtual representation with what they called actual representation. If the people were to be properly represented in a legislature, they declared, not only did the people have to vote directly for the members of the legislature, but they also had to be represented by members whose numbers were proportionate to the size of the population they spoke for. So what was meaningful in England made no sense in America. Unlike England, electoral districts in the New World were not the products of history that stretched back centuries, but were rather recent and regular creations that were related to changes in population. When a new town was created in Massachusetts, for example, in colonial Massachusetts, or a new county created in Virginia, the new representatives customarily were sent to the respective colonial legislatures. Every new town sent 2 representatives, every new county sent 2 representatives to the Virginia legislature. Now this system of actual representation stressed the closest possible ties between the local electors and their representatives. Unlike the English, Americans believed that their representatives had to be residents of the localities they spoke for, and that people of the locality had a right to instruct their representatives. So they had to be, and that's still true, you have to be a representative of your district that you represent. You can't be some carpetbagger who comes in from the outside, unless you become, as Hillary Clinton did, an inhabitant of New York. Americans thought it was only fair that localities be represented more or less in proportion to their population. In short, the Americans' belief in actual representation pointed towards the fullest and most equal participation of the people in the process of government that the modern world up to that time had ever seen. Now, since this actual representation was based on the people's mistrust of those they elected, that's why they wanted close ties, they didn't trust them. They pushed for the most explicit and broadest kind of consent, which generally meant voting. The mutuality of interest that made virtual representation meaningful in England was in America so weak, so tenuous, that the representatives could not be trusted to speak for the interests of their constituents unless they actually voted for them. You can't trust that person up there unless we actually had voted for that person. Actual representation thus made the process of election not incidental, but central to the representative process. You can follow that, that's crucial. The English thought it was incidental. How you got there was irrelevant. It's the mutuality of interest you feel with that, between that representative and yourself that counts. The Americans said we can't trust that. What mutuality of interest? We want to know who that person is, and we want who have elected him. And if we couldn't vote for him, then he can't be our representative. So actual representation became the key, I think, to the peculiarities of American constitutionalism. And people wanted elected officials that were like them in every way, not only in ideas, but in religion, in ethnicity, or social class. We have examples as early as 1775 in Philadelphia, when they formed these revolutionary committees to carry out the revolution, Committee of 19. And suddenly the artisans say, hey, you've got gentlemen on that, in that committee, but no artisans. And then the Germans said, oh no, you got all Anglos on that committee. We want some Germans on that committee. And the Presbyterians said, you got all Anglicans, meaning Episcopal Church people on that committee. or Quakers? Where are the Presbyterians? That kind of diversity, as we would call it, was born right with the Revolution. People felt so mistrustful of the people speaking for them. They wanted people of their own kind, whether that kind was class or ethnicity. So mistrust, in a sense, became the source of American democracy. In fact, the mistrust became so great at times that the representative process was brought into question, and mobs and extra-legal associations emerged to claim to speak more authentically for the people than their elected representatives. The people, it seemed, could be represented in a variety of ways and in a variety of institutions, but no official, however many votes they received, could ever fully embody the people. Now, ultimately, these contrasting ideas of representation separated our system from the English one. In England, Parliament came to possess sovereignty. That is, this final, supreme, indivisible lawmaking authority in the state. There must be in every state, Blackstone said, a final, indivisible, supreme lawmaking authority, and it rests in Parliament. Because the reason for that is because all the estates of the realm, the people, and the nobles are in the Parliament. It embodied the whole society, and nothing existed outside of it. Once it's created, it is the whole society speaking, and that's why it has sovereignty. In America, however, sovereignty remained with the people themselves, and not with any of their agents, or even with all their agents put together. The American people, unlike the English, were never eclipsed by the process of representation, and that's still true. When we elect all of our agents, we still retain some final lawmaking authority ourselves. Otherwise, you couldn't make sense of constitutional conventions, ratification, so on. Now, when Americans referred to the sovereignty of the people, they didn't just mean that all government was derived from the people. Everybody believed that. Instead, they meant that the final, supreme, and indivisible lawmaking authority of the society remained with the people themselves, not with their representatives or with any of their agents. In American thinking, all public officials became delegated and mistrusted agents of the people, temporarily holding bits and pieces of the people's power, which was out, so to speak, on always recallable loan. By thinking of the people in this extraordinary way, Americans were able to conceive of federalism. That is, the remarkable division of power between central and provincial governments, creating two legislatures with different powers operating over the same territory, which was inconceivable to most Englishmen. That is, we have Congress and the separate state legislatures. By doing this, the Americans offered the world a new way of organizing government. Only by conceiving of sovereignty remaining with the people could Americans make sense of their new constitutional achievements, such as the idea of a special constitution-making convention and the process of popular ratification of constitution. In America, the notion that sovereignty rested in the people was not just a convenient political fiction. The American people, unlike the English, retained an actual lawmaking authority. The English did not need conventions and popular ratifications to change their constitution because Parliament was fully and completely the people, and the people did not exist politically or constitutionally outside of it, except at the moment of election. And that's still true. The English people exist only at that moment of election, when they elect a new House of Commons, and then they go out of business until the next election. But that's not true in America. The people remain as a viable, alive, and actually powerful political force. Once election became for Americans the sole criterion of representation, then it was natural to think of all elected officials as somehow representative of the people. Now think of it, at the outset, these state constitutions, with the exception of Pennsylvania, created houses of representatives, but senates as well. Now what are these senates? Are they not representatives? Well, at the outset, no, they weren't representative bodies. They were considered to be the senates, the wise people of the community. They had no constituents. Even though they may have been elected, they weren't considered to be representative bodies. That's why the lower houses were called the houses of representatives. But soon it became difficult to think of the senates as anything but representative. In fact, in Pennsylvania, when they tried to create a senate, because many people felt that Pennsylvania was a flawed constitution because they had no upper house, people said, oh, you want to foist the House of Lords on us, meaning an aristocratic body. And they said, oh, no, no, we're just creating a double representation of the people. That became the justification for a Senate. Well, what does it mean to have the people represented twice? A double, if they can be represented twice, then they can be represented 3 times, 4 times, and that's exactly what happened. Other elected officials, governors, came to be thought of as representatives of the people. If they were elected, yes, then they're representatives. So you began to have the notion of representation spread throughout the whole system. All elected officials were being designated representatives of the people, and the term originally applied to the various houses of representatives and the federal constitution, in the state constitutions and the federal constitution, became awkward reminders that Americans had once thought of representation as the English had, as confined to the lower houses of their legislatures. Now, with the notion of sovereignty remaining with the people, people inevitably concluded that all government officials were somehow their various agents, including even judges. Now, in Federalist 78, Hamilton attempts to, as some of you may know, attempts to justify judicial review. And he refers, to make his argument, he refers to the judges as agents of the people. Not really inferior, he says, to the other agents, the people's other agents in the legislature. Now, he throws that argument out without thinking through the implications of it, because he wanted to simply justify judges setting aside acts of the legislature. And he says, who are these legislators? Do they think they are the people? Why, the judges are just as much the agents of the people as the legislatures. Well, that's an interesting argument, but it has all kinds of implications, and people began drawing out those implications. If judges were indeed the people's agents, as many soon concluded, then rightfully they ought to be elected, especially since elections become the sole measure of representation. If they're going to be my agent, well, I better elect them. And of course, that soon happened. It gets suggested as early as 1805, but it takes another generation. It's in the Jacksonian era where we begin electing our state judges. And today we have 39 states that elect their judges. An extraordinary development, befuddles the world. Sandra Day O'Connor is beside herself trying to fight it. She thinks it's a terrible development. It's created all kinds of problems, particularly in light of some Supreme Court decisions which allow judges to raise money and become politicians and run with a partisan campaign like any other politician. A whole different view of judiciary emerges with that kind of development. Fortunately, the federal system is so hard to amend that we'll probably not have federally elected judges. But it is a development that came out of the logic of thinking of your judges as agents of the people. Since in the American system, the people were never fully embodied in government, all sorts of strange, bizarre political institutions and practices could and eventually did emerge. In the progressive era, we have the development of primaries, referendums, processes of recall, and ballot initiatives. These were introduced by progressive reformers at the beginning of the 20th century, and they are only extensions, if you think about it, of this idea of sovereignty of the people and of the acute actual representation that was created at the outset of the founding of the country. And the recall of Governor Gray Davis and the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor of California in 2003 are kinds of popular actions not likely to be duplicated in any other developed democracy in the world today. Think of it, a governor sitting for 18 months and all of a sudden he's done nothing wrong. He's just simply, they're not popular, and they simply call him back. And of course, the Californians have developed ballot initiatives to the point where the people have become the legislature directly. That's sovereignty of the people in spades, if you will. But once you grasp this peculiar American idea of the sovereignty of the people, these extraordinary political events begin to make some sense. Whether these examples of direct democracy are sensible ways of running a modern democracy, however, remains to be seen. We have to admit, however, that they are thoroughly American. Thank you.